Thank you. As you can see, the title of my talk is quite similar to Soren's, so we try to not overlap our presentation. I'd like to give you a very brief outline of my talk. The first subtopic would be chimeric research, then the potential emergence of sentience or consciousness, and then something about the moral status of human brain organoids. Don't worry, I have a presentation longer than 20-minute talk, but I'll skip some. Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Much more comfortable. But I'll skip something, and I hope we can see more in detail some subtopics during the Q&A session. So, considering the organoid revolution, I'd like to offer you another definition of organoids, since I think not all of you are very familiar with the subfield of biomedical sciences. And so, an organoid can be defined as follows. This is Clevers, who was one of the first to develop organoids in the lab. So this is a graphic representation of the process through which we can have an organoid in the lab. It's a very complex process, but obviously we cannot delve into the details. Considering the ethical issues regarding organoids, as Professor Olm said before, we have some different strands of ethical issues. And in general, we can see that organoids can be, and special expert human organoids can be considered a more acceptable form of experimentation that on human fetuses, animals, and voluntary human adults, obviously. In this case, no living being is destroyed, damaged, or put at risk in tests involving organoids. And also, the level of scientific reliability may be soon, hopefully soon, be equivalent to that of traditional methods. So, we also have that organoids can be cheaper than other forms of experimentation. So we can think that we can celebrate, but I think that we need to be careful in celebrating. So we need to wait for that. Now, we have a list of so-called extrinsic ethical issues regarding organoids, and they are the well-known aspects and well-known in bioethics concerning kinds of donor, informed consent, and so on. But we need to focus today on human brain organoids and some specific aspects. And the first one is the so-called chimeric research. A chimera, as probably you know, is a single organism composed of cells with distinct genotypes. Various forms of chimera research have been taking place without much ethical debate so far. But we now have some wonder about is it ethically appropriate to use in vitro structures of human origin in chimeric research, especially when this may enhance or humanize a non-human animal. So I propose to use some definition of these key terms. Enhancing, in my view, means an augmentation of some functions, and humanizing means providing a non-human animal with human characteristics. Relevant concerns accordingly seems to be that in chimera research we can biologically or morally enhance or can humanize a non-human animal. And again, two definitions. biologically means introducing different cells, and morally means providing them with new higher cognitive functions capable of conferring a diverse moral status to the non-human animal. This definition are drawn from a very recent paper by Herle. And shortly, we'll see something about moral status. In this sense, growing a human organoid in a non-human animal can be difficult to evaluate ethically, both in itself and from the donor's point of view, as you can guess. Non-human chimeras probably have some form of consciousness, as Professor Olm said before, especially higher mammals, and the insertion of human tissues while the animal fetus is developing or after the birth may lead to unknown result. So far, we have no specific guidelines for this kind of research. Very recent papers from these institutions did not introduce specific guidelines or rules for chimeric research. But I'd like to show you a very brief piece of the so-called anticipatory neuroethics, in that we had a statement from a large group of bioethicists and scientists involved in the field, published in 2022, and they wrote, you can look at the final lines, instead of worrying about the emergence of human-like consciousness in animal models, because human neural organoids transplanted into animal lack the overall size, relevant cell types, and proper architecture to support cognitive abilities associated with higher order thinking. But we can consider a paper published just some days before that by Reva and colleagues. This is an image from the paper. Researchers transplanted the three-dimensional human cerebral organoids derived from HIPS cells into the primary somatosensory cortex of immunodeficient rats and early plastic development stage. And this is the point: neurons from transplanted human cerebral organoids undergo substantial maturation, receive thalamocortical and cortical inputs that are capable of evoking sensory responses and extend axonal projection into the rat brain that can drive reward-seeking behaviors. This is exactly what the paper we saw before ruled out absolutely. So this is, I think, a very relevant point in doing neuroethics and considering potential guidelines for this kind of research, because the research is going at a very fast pace, and we cannot exclude that just tomorrow we have new findings, new developments that need to be regulated in some form. So this is just an example. It's not a criticism to the authors of the regulatory paper, but just a way to see how we can do a good anticipatory neuroethics. So we can skip this part, and we can look at the problem of organoid sentience, potential sentience of organoids. Professor Olm made a very good job in showing what is at stake with potential sentience of organoids. But I'd like to show you this quotation from Hank Greeley. He wrote that the dilemma is that if it is looked like a human brain, it acts like a human brain, at what point do we have to treat it like a human brain or a human being? So this is a very difficult question. Probably we do not have, as Professor Olm said, brain organoids capable of behaving as a human brain. and obviously as a human being, but we need to consider some potential scenarios. And so this is a very important and controversial, if you want, study, which has shown that for the first time, the brain organoids generated by pluripotent stem cells can develop periodic and regular oscillatory electrical activity that resembles the EEG patterns of premature newborns. This means that 10-month-old human brain organoids, even in the absence, this is important, of external or subcortical impulse, can develop according to a specific genetic program typical of all humans. The most surprising aspect, this is a very short summary of this complex experiment, an expert software trained with the EEG data of preterm infants was able to evaluate with a good approximation the age of a cerebral organoids based on their electrical activity. It means that the software couldn't distinguish between data from a preterm infant and from a brain organoid. So for the capacity of the machine of distinguishing data from the EEG, there is no difference between the EEG data of a preterm infant and a brain organoid. Obviously, that means that, sorry, this is disturbing, that these kinds of organoids are conscious. By no means. We are sure that they are not, but it means that we need to be careful in considering this strand of research. Okay, I can skip this part. There are many other examples of organoids growing with specific features. This is, I think, quite interesting. I survived with a colleague. Sorry. I survived with a colleague of mine, some scientists, in order to know how they think about the ethical issues concerning organoids, and they told us that they are in general skeptic about consciousness emerging in HBOs today, and in general they are skeptical also considering the near future. And in general, they think that chimeras are no different compared to other animals without ACOs grafts and so on. So the general idea is that scientists are not so concerned about organoid research. It's quite understandable because they are doing that, so they are convinced that they are doing the right thing. It does not come as a surprise, but this is important to be noted because scientists are a very relevant part of this field. Considering sentience and consciousness, I'd like to draw your attention on some definitions which can be helpful. In general, we can think that subjective experience is a general category within which consciousness can be isolated as a more circumscribed phenomenon. And in my view, sentience is the minimum degree at which a living entity can feel something, whereas consciousness is the phenomenal higher level at which an entity can be self-aware as well. But it's important to note that some scholars use these terms in other ways. So this is my perspective. And in general, we can say that this kind of emotions are experienced in a certain way only thanks to the sophisticated processing typical of the nervous system of mammals. It means that only mammals can have a developed consciousness. But again, it's not implausible to suppose that a living being can feel pain and experience lack of air, for example, even without having a inner model of the world of itself. It means that we can have some form of sentience of a lower level of consciousness in non-human animals, which are not mammals, for example. And then, I don't know how much time left.
I think a few more minutes are okay.
Okay, so skip this part and we can go back to that during the discussion. This is a table in which we can compare different theories of consciousness in order to evaluate how can they work with organoids, but this can be seen later, and this is another possibility of measuring consciousness in organoids, but again, we can talk about that later. And now something about moral status. Okay, probably you know that we have two different kinds of questions with brain organoids in this sense. The first is an ontological and ethical one. It concerns how to identify what consciousness is and what characteristics attribute moral status to an entity. And the second is an epistemic one. It concerns how consciousness can be found and evaluated on the characteristics that allow moral status to be given. And in the case of cerebral organoids, moral status is linked to the presence of forms of sentient consciousness, so that the identification of the characteristic capable of motivating the attribution of moral status derives from the presence of evidence of consciousness. So I know it's quite complex, but I think it's important to be precise and have a solid argument about that. Moral status and moral value. Moral status in general, as you probably know, is a condition for which a certain entity receives consideration in the ethical sphere for being that entity, and not only for its relation with other entities. There is a property which confers the moral status to that entity. And we can have also a pyramid of moral status, because moral status is not equivalent to moral value. And in my opinion, moral status can come in degrees. Not all scholars agree on that. There are only thresholds. If you overcome the threshold, you have moral status. If you don't, you cannot be given moral status. But in my opinion, we can have different degrees of moral status based on the moral status property we have and the degree at which we have that property. So, granting moral status are related. Moral status is related to subjective interest, which are linked to certain subjective experiences. So to obtain moral status, it is necessary to have some form of sentient of consciousness, and moral status can, as said, be attributed on various justification. In the case of human cerebral organoids, the necessary premise seems to be the possession of subjective interest, and therefore to have some minimal form of consciousness. It has the sentience, for example, if cerebral organoids possess this characteristic, they would not qualify them as entity with a moral status as such. They would probably have to reach a certain threshold of complexity. So we cannot state that organoids with a moral status, and they could have moral status if they have a minimal degree of sentience, have specific rights, as Professor Holm said before, but I think that we need to consider the possibility to attribute moral status to sentient organoids. So this is the main philosophical basis of the debate, which is, as you have seen, quite complex, but I think it's worth pursuing in order to better understand what is at stake in this field of research. So I think I can stop here, but we can come back to some other aspects of organoids and their ethical issues. So this is the answer, the question, sorry, we need to address. What should we do if cerebral organoids presented a glimmer of consciousness in the form of integrated information? I skipped that part, but integrated information is a specific theory of consciousness. But in general, we can say that. We will be able to use brain organoids to try to unravel the mystery of consciousness. This is another pressing question, because so far we are using organoids in order to try to have new treatments or drugs and so on. But another potential line of research is that concerning the development of consciousness in the human brain. We can try to have this living lab, so to say, in order to evaluate the development of consciousness, something which is not possible with living entities today. And ultimately, do we need new spatial reuse for creation of and use of human cerebral organoids? This is the big question. And thank you for your attention.